Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the many policies and regulations that affect American agriculture. Each week, we pull back the curtain on the programs, policies, and perceptions shaping the agricultural community in rural America. If you've ever felt like something doesn't add up, you're not alone. I'm Jenny, and this is Smoke and Mirrors. Let's make sense of the maze we call farm policy.
Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. The topic today is making sense of the relationships that make policy happen. I'm excited to have Michael Torrey with me. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself and the work that Torrey Advisory Group does?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. First of all, thanks for asking me to join the podcast. I'm very excited that you're doing this. I think anytime that you can shed light on what is happening with food and ag policy and how it works, that all ships rise. Jenny, so thank you for giving me a chance to do this today. A quick background on myself. I'm a native of Kansas. I grew up just south of Wamego, active in 4-H and FFA, was a College of Ag graduate at Kansas State University. I spent a few years in the state of Kansas working for a couple of agribusiness trade associations, and then in 1990, I moved out to Washington, D.C. Hard to believe that it's been this long. So the 35 years I've been here, about 10 of those years have been in some sort of public service. That included, and some of your listeners will remember, the likes of Nancy Kassebaum and Bob Dole. I spent a few years as a political appointee at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, working for another Kansan, Dave Spears, and then finished up my federal service at USDA during Bush II as the Deputy Chief of Staff there for the Secretary. And in 2005, we started the Torrey Advisory Group, focused on food and ag policy.
And so how much of the work you do in the Torrey Advisory Group is about relationships, about building relationships and maintaining relationships?
Sure. Let me give you just a little bit more color on the Torrey Advisory Group, because that may kind of help set the stage. So when I say that we're involved in food and ag policy, that means all aspects, if you will. It used to be that when we thought of that, it was very basic. There weren't a lot of issues surrounding it. Most of it happened in the Ag Committee. A few other committees got involved, but that whole world has changed now so that everything is intertwined. All the silos between the different industries, those walls have been broken down. And so when we talk about how we communicate, a big part of it is who we communicate with. And it's no longer just the House and Senate Ag Committee. It's the Appropriations Committee. It's the Help Committee, the Energy and Commerce Workforce Committee, and Energy and Commerce. On the House side, there's just so many different issues that touch the farm. There's so many other folks that want to be involved in the lives of how we grow and process and distribute our food. And we have a team here of about 14 folks that are involved in communicating or building relationships with others in some capacity.
So I think we could start first. There's a lot of aspects to sort of picking through how relationships play a role in policy. I'm going to start with communications of policy needs. Individuals and organizations both have to communicate their needs or preferences about policies to elected officials. Could you talk about what role relationships play in this?
Yes, and I want to set the stage on that. It used to be you communicated through phone call or a conversation, and then we got email, so we communicated with that. But the bigger issue happened in 2007 when the iPhone came into our lives and social media with that. And then the landscape of communication was turned upside down. So while having a relationship or a friendship with somebody is still probably the most important, there are a lot of competing ways on how communication occurs. And I mentioned the iPhone because suddenly somebody could have an opinion and decide they want to communicate it to the world, and based upon how entertaining that opinion is, or insightful, if I don't want to be sarcastic, or how many followers they had, suddenly they were communicating something that required you to communicate, perhaps at a disadvantage, if you will. And so those of us in food and ag have been a victim of how different organizations, social media influencers, some of those are for-profit entities, how they communicate, oftentimes claiming to do so on our behalf, or criticizing or attacking what it is those in the food and ag sector do every day. So that is a complicated answer to a very simple question. But at the end of the day, a personal relationship still matters.
So personal relationships are still foundational, you would say, but on top of that, you have to manage the broader social media environment. Do you have social media, a staff member at Torrey Advisory Group that works on social media exclusively, or do you work with outside organizations on this?
We have folks on the team that work on social media. I don't know that we have someone exclusively at this time. But I can tell you that if you go back to when we started if you go back to how organizations were structured, it used to be that you had a comms team, or you'd hire a grassroots team, or you'd hire a Republican firm or a Democratic firm or a grass tops firm. And because information moves so fast now, and all of those different functions have been consolidated under one roof. So on our team, we have more than one person who has a background in communications. Now, they may be doing advocacy now, but they also have the ability and from time to time are required to do things on other playing fields that relate to what the client needs are.
Working in extension, I certainly appreciate that necessity. It's a part of all of what we do. Well, maybe let's go back to that foundational level of relationships when you have, whether it's a agricultural company, an agribusiness, or a producer group or anything, and they have a policy need or a policy interest, and they're trying to communicate that to Congress or the executive branch. Those personal relationships still matter. Could you give an example or sort of walk us through that a little bit?
So if you put yourself in the shoes of your senator or your member of Congress and think about, they represent the whole district or they represent the whole state. And if you just, don't make me do the math, but let's just say they do, 9 meetings a day, which I think is pretty conservative. And they're probably doing meetings, not every day of the year, but almost every day of the year, let alone everything else that goes with it. They have so much information and so many data points hitting them that when you have a view or a position, either as a constituent or as an organization that you're a part of, your job is to try to communicate in a way that they remember you or your organization when it matters most, whether that's a vote or a drafting of a bill or sending a letter or asking a question at a hearing. You want to communicate so that they recall that issue, that they understand that issue, that they have a connection with it. And there's a lot of ways to do that. The most important way is to be either a constituent or have a constituent interest. So if you're a company, maybe you're located in the district and you have team members there. Or you're a farmer and you farm in the district or the state. But let's say you don't have a physical presence. Let's say that you're an organization and you advocate for a value or a belief or a social-based issue. Then how does that issue overlay with that member's state or district that it's so important that they are willing to vote with you or support you?
You have members of Congress or folks in the executive branch that have limited time, and you want to make sure that they're going to stick with you and remember what you say.
Yes.
And linking it back to constituents is really important. So that's clear. And in your work or in general, are you trying to build a sort of ongoing relationship with some of those offices?
We do. And that's another issue. Your listeners, a lot of them, I don't know what the demographic is of your listeners, but they will remember that the turnover in Congress, turnover being defined as when the House goes Republican, the Democrat, or vice versa, or when the Senate flips parties, or when the White House changes parties. That used to happen in either the House or the Senate or the White House once or twice a decade. If you go to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, but since 2000, it's happened every election, I think, except for 2. Meaning that just when you have built a relationship, that relationship or that person's ability to help you on your issue may change in the next election. And so what we always say is the mistake that's made is don't think you can come in and you have an issue and there's a vote in a month or a week and you can somehow go in there and make a difference right then. Folks have been working on that issue for months or years, and you have to be a part of that ongoing process so when everything lines up. Immigration's a great example. The last time we had immigration reform was in the 80s. Pretty confident most of your listeners believe that something needs to happen on immigration reform. I mean, clearly we have labor challenges in rural America, in our food companies, in our processing. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we have been harping on this issue, to borrow a word from my mother, for a very long time. And eventually something's going to happen. And we can just hope that when it does, a lot of the things that we've been advocating for are part of that final solution.
Well, I teach this in my agricultural policy class, and I have a list of all the bills that were proposed to Congress and maybe got close, but I have some sense that what went into these bills was a lot of tough conversations between the farm worker advocates and the producer groups. But it seems like there's always a lot of common ground within those conversations to lead to those bills. So it seems like there is some role of those sort of relationships or communication into at least getting that put together.
You know, the great example, and let's just stick with immigration when you talk about people finding agreement, it's not as if people can't find agreement on the issue.
Yeah.
When it comes to Capitol Hill, it's the outside influences. And it's not necessarily the outside influences from their district or state. It's the outside interests from the activist community, many who make money by having this issue stay alive. And the last thing they want or need is a solution to this issue. It is a huge revenue generator and employs a lot of folks in the NGO community. They don't want this issue to go away. And I know I'm being cynic about it, but clearly we have a problem, and members of Congress that are representing rural America want to do something about it. But the activist community has been able to leverage grassroots within their own states, not based on sound economics, based upon emotions and feelings and fear. And that has had an impact. It's having an impact on the livelihoods of folks in the state of Kansas. If any state, it is having an impact.
Right.
And I'm not getting into everything that's going on right now. That's separate. I'm sticking to the legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're saying that on the Capitol Hill that groups can come together and work out compromises, and it happens a lot. But activist groups have had an outsized influence and can sort of run counter to compromises or what otherwise would be a solution.
Yeah, that's a fair statement.
How do you advise people to handle this?
Well, first of all, don't give up. I mean, you've got to tell your story, and you have to keep telling it. And for those of you that are involved in food and agriculture, you know there's fewer of you. And so it's more important now than ever before. You just can't sit back and think the other person's going to do it. It's really requiring everybody to be involved. We've got some good folks from our community that have run and been elected into office. So they're there as champions and friends and understand the issues and what's going on. I think that for all of us, we just keep telling our story. There's a lot of headlines right now. There's a lot of everybody trying to throw a touchdown pass, on an issue. And our counsel has always been do the blocking and the tackling and the basics, and this will eventually work itself out. Some of the ideas that we see being adopted, they're forced upon constituencies. And I think that anybody that has had something forced on them, you know how long you're willing to kind of tolerate that. Eventually you look for an opportunity to kind of undo it or push back. So you got to play the long game a little bit. I think we're in a good environment right now. I do think that food is a central issue, both for processors and for the farmer. And this is a great time for us to be telling our story. And I've seen some decisions. We've all seen some decisions that have been a little bit of a head scratcher. But at the same time, I do believe that those folks that are impacting policy are very sincere in wanting to make things better. So again, I think it's just telling the story. And clearly right now in Washington, D.C., we have an administration that really has put a premium on wanting to hear what folks in the countryside think. And I think whenever you hear that there's an opportunity to go and be with those individuals that want to hear your thoughts, people should show up and be a part of that.
So we've talked about communicating policy needs. Maybe we can switch gears now to we actually got into creating legislation a little bit. I'm trying to work through the the process. But when something is actually happening, I'd assume that relationships, whether it's between the staffers and the members of Congress that write legislation or the executive branch, I can imagine that they're quite important during that process as well when the rubber's starting to hit the road.
It is. And that process has changed of late. It used to be, think about how we were all taught on how a bill becomes legislation, right? A member of Congress introduces the bill based upon feedback that they have from whoever they're working with to introduce that bill for. That bill then gets a hearing, and maybe it is eventually marked up in committee. A committee hearing is marked up in committee, and then eventually it goes to the House or Senate floor where it's brought up, it's discussed, it's amended. And then it goes to conference between the House and the Senate, and it's reconciled. And then it goes back to the House and the Senate for final approval, and then to the president's desk. That's not right now how Congress legislates. And the way they legislate has changed significantly so that while input is gathered and there are markups and there are a lot of hearings, at the end of the day, legislation is finalized by a select few. The select few may be, for example, in the ag world, may be part of what we call the four corners, meaning the chair and ranking of the House and Senate Ag Committee. It's always going to have to involve somebody in leadership, normally both on the Republican and Democratic side. So if you think about how do you impact legislation and communicate your concerns, it does involve your member of Congress, your elected representative, but being able to have influence or impact over those individuals that are ultimately in the room at the end of the day is also important.
So I get the sense that a lot of legislation that passes now is a part of reconciliation or spending bills. And it seems like those are compromises that sometimes get hammered out by a select few at the last minute. So I can imagine that's something that's difficult to manage.
Yeah, we're in a unique environment in history. The House has had margins this small, but it's been a long time. So right now we're just in an environment in the House of Representatives where the margin is so small that they've had difficulty coming up with solutions. And I blew it on this one. I thought that the margin of the House being so small meant that they were going to ultimately have to be more bipartisan. But what we've seen is House leadership has, for the most part, been successful in kind of getting folks to walk the same way. They did do reconciliation, and that is, of course, done for your listeners, that it's done because that way the bill that's sent from the House of Representatives to the Senate only requires a majority vote, 50 plus,
right,
instead of a filibuster of 60 votes. So it was a way to accommodate the Senate to get something done. I don't know, this ability to kind of pass legislation with small margins. Right now, I think it's under threat. They may very well pass a bill today.
Could you give us some examples of where the sort of relationships between these different players helped get something through that a lot of people have put a lot of work into, or maybe the opposite, where there was a lot of effort and relationship building that went into something that didn't get through at the end of the day?
I can talk about the relationships that members of Congress have with each other. And I would say that in my time in town, there has been a breakdown in those relationships. And we can speculate all day long about why that occurred. But I'll just be a little bit flippant in that members of Congress of both parties used to be able to spend time together, socializing, whether it was an overseas trip, to dig in on whatever issue they were working on or whatever it was. But they had the time to be together, to know each other personally. And in Congress doing that, it's just like any job you have. If you have a job, there are folks that you may not always agree with that you need to socialize with a little bit. And that helps when you're in a fire. But it's not as if it doesn't happen at all, because it still does happen. There are plenty of Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate that are friends and that they try to work together on bipartisan legislation. And they've had some success on that. The whole milk bill that's going to provide whole milk in schools as part of the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, that just passed the House on a bipartisan basis. It passed the Senate on a bipartisan basis. So there are a lot of things that happen day in and day out where Republicans and Democrats can agree. And that's a bill we've been trying to pass for a very long time, and we're unable to do so. So it still works.
Well, I have a kid that's a picky eater, and we think whole milk is great. Do you think the differences, you talked when we started about how social media and activists are playing a big role. Do you think the differences sometimes get amplified?
Because of social media?
Or something related to
Well, I mean,
that?
if you got one, I don't look at social media very much because it's maddening. There's so many folks that want to have an opinion based upon something that they see, and they don't have all the data points. And look, I get that. That's human nature.
Right.
And I think everybody that has a bad day wants to go out and provoke somebody else by saying something, and they're able to do it without really being held accountable. We have a social media environment that has no liability protection, so you can go out and say things that aren't true, and there's no consequences for that, unlike, what you can say on radio and TV. So we have an environment right now that's incredibly difficult to have thoughtful policy debates. I think Maha has seen a little bit of that as well. On the one hand, I think we can all agree on the health of America and that things are going on. But I think when you start thinking you have a solution on the cause, I think that some of those solutions are a little bit subjective. But, the emotion is there and folks are charging forward, and we'll see how this plays out.
I always start my ag policy class. We talk about political difference. We focus on policy, but you have to kind of acknowledge the political environment.
Well, I would say from a governance standpoint, I know that a lot of folks are caught up right now on how we communicate with each other. But as a country, it's not the first time we've been through some of these challenges, and it's not going to be the last time. And some of the challenges that we've seen in terms of communication have resulted in violence or death in our political system. And we're in an era right now where folks are kind of finding new footing. They're testing the boundaries of that speech and how we communicate with each other. And we're kind of in an environment where if you say the wrong thing, there are consequences, and sometimes those are really bad consequences. And maybe you've said the right thing, but somebody else thinks it's wrong. It's subjective. And so it has everybody a little bit on pins and needles. And this is going to have to sort itself out. And that's what elections are for. Elections help sort some of these things out. And I think we're starting to see some of the fallout where we're seeing individual members of Congress in both parties that are starting to raise concerns, second guess leadership a little bit. And so I think for all of us, for your listeners, it's just the more you stick to the story of truth, science and facts. And truth, by the way, is a funny thing. I've discovered that the use of the word liar has is getting used a lot. And I first noticed it when my daughter would say they lied. And I worked to help her understand, because she was a child, there's a difference between lying and somebody having an opinion that's different than yours, right? But unfortunately, while I've been able to try to teach her, and she's 16 now, what lying is and isn't, we see that all the time by adults on TV, radio. They're like, oh, they lied. But I don't think they lied and hid the facts. I think they just had an opinion that was different, and therefore it somehow has morphed its way into a lie. And it's not a lie. It's saying the same thing, but just using, kind of some different aspects.
Could we also talk about sort of relationships and communication when different groups are working directly with the executive branch, maybe regulators or other agencies that you have to work with as a normal part of your business?
Yeah, we work with regulators quite a bit, and it's a different role that they have from the legislative branch. The legislation is going to be kind of the bill with some parameters, but at the end of the day, somebody has to implement these ideas, and some of these ideas are really good, and they're well formed in legislation, and they're well formed in report language, and sometimes they're not, and therefore the regulator, the administration, and this is a Republican and Democrat challenge, they've got to put the details together to make the program workable. And they do that by issuing proposed rulemakings, and that has a notice and comment period. That's all part of the Administrative Procedures Act that has been around for a very long time. And ultimately, that results in a final rule. But whatever it is, what you have to do is you've got to go down before you have a ban on being able to comment. Once a rule's been issued and it's out for comment, the regulators are not able to have a conversation with you in a way that's a give and take. They can only listen. So you want to be with those regulators before the rule is proposed while they're writing it to kind of provide your take on how the issues should be resolved. And then they can decide if that's in the rule, if it's a question they ask as a part of the rule, to gather broader feedback.
So my listeners, are from across the spectrum of people working in agriculture, from producers to other academics. I've gotten a few messages about that. Do you have any advice broadly for for building relationships and thinking about either representing your own needs to policymakers or trying to inform policy?
I've got some advice here, but I want to take a second and talk about what a lobbyist is and is not, because I think it's relevant for folks in rural America. I think, first of all, I would say that everybody hates lobbyists except the one that represents them. So if you're a farmer, you may hate lobbyists, but you probably like your Farm Bureau lobbyist or your wheat grower lobbyist, or pick your interest. The second thing is that, it's fun to go after lobbyists, but if you, in the room that you're in, or if you're a listener, just take a moment, wherever you're sitting, everything around you, everything has a lobbyist. The ceiling, the carpet, the table, the chairs, your clothes, your body, your truck, your tractor, and several different pieces, different components, they all have a lobbyist. They all have an advocate. So when someone says they're anti-lobbyist, I think they have to be very careful that they don't take that to the next step and say, I'm anti-lobbyist and therefore I'm not going to advocate, because that's cutting your nose off in spite of your face in this environment. I wish it weren't the case. I wish that Washington, D.C. was not so involved in our lives that we had to be even having this conversation, but it is. And so my counsel to rural America is you have to be active and you have to be engaged, as we talked about before. And that means tell your story. And the best place to tell the story is out there where you live. Look, we have folks that come fly in all the time. If who have been invited to do a fly-in and you haven't, you should do it. It's very important. But these members of Congress, they have office hours, they have district offices, they have state offices, they have team members there that take that information, pick up the phone and call. And it can be simple. Like, here's what happened on my farm because I can't get labor. And base it on numbers and facts. I wasn't able to do this, or I did this, or it impacted me this way, and it cost me this much money. I could go on and on here about the thing. But you got to tell your story. And I wish I didn't have to sit here and, again, in the words of Barb, harp on this, but it does. It's just where we are. So that's one of the things I would pass along.
So when I go to D.C., I usually go visit staffers on the Hill and the Senate and that House offices. And it's always sort of shocking to me how accessible it is. I mean, if you want to go to the White House or to Congress, there's a ton of security.
Mm-hmm.
But I can walk into one of those office buildings. You go through a metal detector, no big deal. And you're just, you're going by the office of all these different senators or all these different representatives that you heard of, and you can walk in there and there's somebody sitting there to sort of help you figure it out. It's always amazing to me how accessible that is.
There's been a lot of time spent by Congress and government about how to have security, but not in a way that our government is not accessible to the people. And so if you go around the Capitol, for example, after 9/11, they wanted to put a big fence around there. Well, you don't see a fence, but I guarantee if you look close enough, you'll see a very nicely decorated barricade that is in the form of these little poles that I promise you the underpinning of those are 20 feet into the ground, anchored by a lot of concrete.
Right.
Same for the White House when they cut down, the ability to drive by. In the House and Senate, the closest they've come to it, to your point, has been metal detectors. Anybody can go in there, and walk around and go into offices. And it is kind of a nice thing to be able to have. And I hope that doesn't change. And, as a former Hill staffer, constituents call. And back in my day, if Bob Dole or Nancy Kassebaum had a constituent that called or wrote and it fell to me to answer them and I didn't, I got in a lot of trouble. And I think that's probably still the case. I think it's probably still the case.
Is something that you wish people understand better about your work? I feel like you kind of answered that one already when you talked about lobbying. But what is something you wish people together? If you were in charge for a day and there's one policy you could change, what would it be?
Oh, give me a second. If I could change one policy, I want to be careful here. I know the problem I want to solve. I don't know the policy I want that I would have to be able to solve it with. I'm going to tell you the problem that I think we need to solve. Maybe one of your listeners will know how to get a policy around this. And I'm going to use an example, and I'm not using it. Just ask your listeners for a little space for grace here. I'm not saying this to take a position or a side. But it has to do with the functioning of our government. And there's a few symptoms of that that are a problem. One is federal spending. Right now, I think everybody knows that we have a debt as a country in the $36 to $37 trillion range. And I think we all know that each year, most of that now is being made up of mandatory spending and now interest. And it is at a point that the market is going to say, yeah, you guys can't do this, United States of America, and there's going to be consequences for this. And we've seen policymakers, both Republican and Democrat, they can point fingers at each other, but there's nobody pure in this. Spend money to meet the needs of their constituents, refuse to address problems that are in the room because of their political fear. Social Security is a great example, not a hard fix there, but something that could be fixed. And so instead of members of Congress and government being able to operate with a long-term attitude, everything is like, it's got to be quick today. What have you done for me lately? And that is hurting our governance structure and therefore our country. And I have a lot of ideas on how to fix that policy-wise, but I really don't want to be throwing those out into a void where I can't look somebody in the eye if I upset them and be able to talk it through. The other piece of this that we've seen is the function of government. And I'll use an example. If you asked any Republican or Democrat or bipartisan or nonpartisan career federal employee, do they think the government can work better? They would say, absolutely. We've been trying to do this for years. When Biden asked federal employees to come back or Trump asked them to come back, there were federal employees that were cheering that decision. If you go back to pretty much every administration, but I think about Bush too and others, they all had ways that they wanted to reform government, and they kept running into obstacles. What Trump did was brilliant. He just went in and ripped the Band-Aid off and did it. And now it's gone, that pendulum will swing back on him. The point being that government needs reformed, and everybody knows it. And the fact that it is so difficult to do it in a way that's sustainable and long-term, that's a process that's also broken. So we have a spending process that's broken. We have a government functionality problem that's broken. And we have folks that are elected to either 2-year or 6-year terms or 4-year terms that are charged with fixing it. And we have a process problem. So that's what we need to fix.
Well, I do a lot of my work on the farm safety net, and I think it would apply to that as well. This issue that our current system doesn't reward long-term policy or thinking. That's pretty fair. Could you describe the work that Torrey Advisory Group does?
I can. Yeah. So it did start off as Michael Torrey Associates because it was just me. And today we've rebranded a couple of times. So we're the Torrey Advisory Group. We've tried to make it less about Mike because we have a team now, and we've just continued to grow. So we have a lot of different interests involved. And when I started it, I felt like I kind of had a 360 view of food and ag policy, having grown up on a farm and farmed, and then different jobs and careers in the food industry and public service. And I also had a network. So I had some substance, I had a network, and I felt like, we were a pretty comprehensive package. And then, we've continued to work to build that out. So we focus on issues that matter most to me and us as a team, which is food and ag. I'm not taken away from firms that focus on healthcare or telecom. They make a lot more money, I can tell you that. But at the end of the day, if you don't have food, the society absolutely breaks down. And we've got a pretty good history that points to that being true. So that's why I've really focused on that. I don't look, and we as the team, I know I speak for them, we don't look at this as transactional. We look at this as transformative. I'm not so egotistical to say that somehow we're the keepers of anything, but I would use crop insurance as a great example. We built a significant coalition to protect the farmer safety net. We built that here in the firm, and it has served its purpose time and again in protecting rural America and our risk management program, right? So I see that as a higher calling, if you will. We have broad connections in the food and ag sector, so it's not just on the farmer and food companies or on the Hill or the NGOs. I mean, someone on the team, is going to know somebody somewhere. And of course, I think we work very hard to have strong personal relationships with our clients. Again, we don't look at it as transactional. We want to know what you care about. And then we want to do whatever we can to make your life better, to make the lives of those you represent better. Again, we take that very serious. And the one thing I'll tell you what, the reason I didn't go into farming is that, man, nothing just came easy for me. I tipped over a truck. I drove into a shed. I mean, I did everything. I just was not mechanically inclined, much to my father's disappointment. But at the same time, I knew or learned somewhere early on how to fix a problem, not a mechanical problem, but a problem that somebody had. And that's what we get every day is somebody's got a problem with the government, with their business, and how the two knit together. And so that's what we do. I mean, we fix people's problems, and that's the one thing that kind of always came natural for me. So I don't know. I got a little personal there, but that's why we started the firm, and I'm working very hard to create a little bit of a legacy firm so that we're bringing on smart, talented individuals that care, and hopefully we'll just keep kind of continuing to grow and build that. And we've had a lot of success with it. And I'm so proud to be a K-Stater and to continue to be active in the Flinch Ball, but through the Food and Ag Policy Fellowship Program that we've created. The university creates a lot of great kids, and they go on and do well in life. So, yeah, thanks for having me, Jenny.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I certainly learned a lot from the conversation.
I'm glad somebody did.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Smoke and Mirrors. If today made you think or see things a little differently, share it with someone who appreciates cutting through the noise. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for spending part of the day with us. Until next time, keep asking what matters.